Hi, how you doing, econ students? This is Mr. Clifford. Welcome to ACDC Econ. Right now we're talking about floating and fixed exchange rates. You should have already watched the video explaining the demand and supply for different currencies and how we get an exchange rate. You should also understand the idea of appreciation and depreciation. Now, it turns out there's two different types of exchange rates. There's floating and there's fixed. A floating exchange rate is one that fluctuates with the market. So if demand goes up or down or supply goes up and down, the exchange rate is going to change. And the market sets the exchange rate. A fixed exchange rate is when the government takes control and tries to peg one currency's value to another currency. The government doesn't allow market forces to work, and they try to keep that exchange rate fixed, or at least in some sort of range. It seems like we have that debate a whole lot in economics. Right? Should the government do something, or should they stay out of our way? We talked about price controls in markets, when we talked about minimum wage, we talked about fiscal policy, monetary policy, and it's the same situation here. I can't tell you if having a floating or a fixed exchange rate's better. I can just tell you what they are, and you can decide for yourself. The policy you prefer depends a lot on how much exports and imports are of your GDP. So if you don't sell or buy things a lot from other countries, it's not going to affect you much. But if you do buy or sell things from other countries, keeping an eye on the exchange rate is super important. For example, if you're a business in one country and you sign a long-term contract with a business in another country, you got to keep an eye on the exchange rate. If the currency of the other country appreciates a whole lot relative to yours, that can cost you a whole lot of money. So how might a country set or peg its exchange rate to another currency? To learn this, let's go to the graph and look at the supply and demand for dollars relative to Chinese yuan. We've got the downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve, and together they've set the exchange rate. Instead of having a floating exchange rate that can go anywhere, let's say the United States decides to fix their exchange rate with China. Yeah, I know, it's ironic, I know. So in this make-believe world, let's say the United States has a whole lot of exports to China. Yes, that's definitely make-believe. Now let's assume that the demand goes up for dollars because the Chinese want to buy more American products. So now the dollar is going to appreciate relative to the Chinese yuan. Now in this make-believe world, the government decides they don't want that to happen. If the dollar appreciates, that's going to make United States goods more expensive for the Chinese, so they're going to buy less of our stuff. So the government wants to keep the exchange rate the same as it was before. And to do that, they have three different options. First, the government could decrease interest rates. This would decrease capital inflows in the United States, and so people would take their money and put it somewhere else because there's relative higher interest rates in other countries. That would decrease the demand for the dollar, causing the exchange rate to fall. The second option is for the United States government to start buying a lot of Chinese currency. Yes, I know, ironic. Yes, I get it. This would increase the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange, causing the exchange rate to fall. The third thing the government can do is have some sort of foreign exchange control, which would limit the transactions for people who are buying and selling dollars. For example, they could set some sort of policy saying the Chinese can't buy certain United States assets. This would decrease the demand for dollars and would cause the exchange rate to go back to the original equilibrium. In all three cases, the government is trying to manipulate the market to set exchange rate. And again, the government might want to do this because they want to keep exchange rates artificially low to increase exports. Now, in real life, the United States, Canada, and the UK all have floating exchange rates. Hong Kong, Argentina, and Bulgaria all have fixed exchange rates. And other countries have established some sort of range that the currency has to stay in between. So if their currency starts to appreciate or depreciate outside that range, the government gets involved. I hope this video helped you understand the idea of floating and fixed exchange rates. Make sure to take a look at the
Hi, it's Paddy Hirsch at Marketplace. So this week, China unpegged its currency from the US dollar, and a lot of people are asking us, what does this peg actually do? How does a peg actually work? So I'm thinking about currencies and pegs and things. I'd like to think along nautical lines. So I'd like you to join me and think about a yacht. Here's a yacht, it's going out on a sailing race. And usually when you go out on a sailing race, you go out to win, of course. But in this race, I've decided that I want to stay level with another yacht. I'm going to pick another yacht and I'm going to say, I'm going to hang out level with this yacht, stay level with this yacht for the whole duration of the race. I may move a little bit forward or a little bit back, but essentially I want to remain pretty much level. So here's the yacht I picked. There's a chap in the back there. And here's my yacht, all right? And just because of perspective, it looks like I'm in front, but it's actually dead level. So here we are in my yacht. And my yacht's obviously slightly differently made to this yacht, so I've got to be careful about the weather, because I know that in some cases, he's going to be faster than me, and in some cases I'm going to be faster than him, and I'm going to have to compensate for that. So how do I do that? How do I slow myself down or speed myself up? Well, essentially what I do is I haul on the ropes in the boat, these things called the sheets. So if I'm falling behind, okay, I pull in hard on the ropes. Say I'm falling behind back here. I pull in hard on the ropes, and that tightens up the sails. And what happens? It means I go shooting forward a lot faster, all right? And if I'm going too fast, like say I'm moving in front of him, what do? I just do the reverse. I just let go of the rope, all right? It means that the sails sort of luff up a little bit, and it means that I then slow down. And slow down to where I need to be so that I stay level with this boat. So how does that, what does that have to do with currencies? Well, it's essentially the same thing. You have one country decides that it wants to peg its currency to another, so it says, I want to move at the same speed as this country in terms of currency. And usually the reason it does that is because it's the currency that it's pegging itself to is the currency of a large trading nation or one of its biggest trading partners. And what it wants to do is, there are obviously all sorts of variables in trade, but one of them is currency fluctuations. So in order to get some stability in your trade with this country, what you can do is you can just peg your currency so that the exchange rate is always going to be the same. And it takes out a lot of uncertainty in the dealings with that country and with when you're buying and selling in that country. So how do you do that? So that's why they do it. So how does it actually work? Well, it's kind of like pulling on this rope or letting go of the rope. Same thing happens. If you're slowing down, if your currency is becoming devalued, say the price of your currency is falling in comparison to the country that you want to be to stay level with, what you do is you basically pull your currency out of the market. You decrease the amount of supply of your currency that's in the open market. And of course, we all know that supply and demand imbalance. That means that if there's less supply, it means that, that's right, the price is going to go up. So the price of your currency is going to rise in comparison to this other currency, and you're going to draw back level with it. How do you do that? Well, most countries, smart countries, have foreign reserves, currencies other than their own currency. They'll maybe hold US dollars or euros or gold, and they'll spend that in order to buy that currency to get their own currency out of the market to bring them up, okay, level with the currency that they want to peg to. What happens if their currency becomes too expensive in comparison to the other currency? Like say they're moving too far ahead. Well, what they do is they let the rope go. All right, they let the rope out. They let more currency into the market. They sell their currency into the market. What happens? That means that because of the supply and demand imbalance, or supply and demand balance, as we know, when you've got too much supply or you've got oversupply, that's right, it brings the price of the currency back down, and it brings you level, okay, level again with the currency that you want to be level with in the first place. So you can see the advantages of having like a currency peg for trade. But there, of course, is some rather big disadvantages. The biggest of which probably is that you are pegged to the fortunes of this economy once you pegged your currency to it. So if this economy runs into trouble, so the winds of change.
There's a simple mechanism that can help countries around the world avoid inflation. Hello, I'm Steve Forbes, and this is What's Ahead, where you get the insights you need to better navigate these turbulent times. Hardly a day goes by without news of a country experiencing a seriously inflationary crisis. Lebanon, Argentina, Venezuela, and other states are in the midst of wild inflations. Even milder rates of inflation, like that which Turkey is experiencing, are damaging. A weak and unstable money severely hobbles economic growth. Productive investment slumps. Investing is risky enough without the added danger that you'll get paid back in a currency whose real value is shrinking. Indeed, capital flees the country. There is a mechanism that, when properly deployed, promptly ends debilitating bouts of inflation. It's called a currency board, a device that has been around 150 years. When put into effect, currency boards have always worked. A government simply uses a sound or widely used currency, which is called an anchor currency, to back its own money. Its money is 100% backed by that anchor currency. Theoretically, gold could be used as the anchor, which might make sense for South Africa, a major gold mining country. The central bank of the currency board country has no discretion. It can't print money independently, can't set interest rates. People at any time can turn in their local currency for the anchor currency, and vice versa. Now that's what local citizens love. Their politicians can't mess with the value of their money. Take the case of Bulgaria, which in the 1990s was experiencing hyperinflation. The country called in the world's foremost currency board expert, Johns Hopkins economics professor Steve Hanke, for help. A board was set up. The Bulgarian currency, the lev, was fixed to the German mark. Now, subsequently, Germany switched into the euro, as did the anchor currency of Bulgaria's currency board. But overnight, the inflationary panic ended, the lev became a trusted currency, and with that stability, the economy expanded. The Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had similar experiences in the 1990s when they won their independence from the former Soviet Union. Hyperinflation followed by the creation of currency boards. Several years later, all three successfully switched to the euro. Hong Kong has successfully had a currency board tying their currency to the US dollar since the early 1980s. The IMF is supposed to help countries heal their troubled economies. Unfortunately, this agency habitually prescribes policies that hurt more than help, especially higher taxes and currency devaluations. The US should forcefully recommend that the IMF make currency boards a routine recommendation for getting countries back on their feet. The IMF and central banks must get over the destructive idea that a little bit of inflation is good. Inflation is a demoralizing disease, period. I'm Steve Forbes. Thanks for listening. Do send in your comments.
In this video, we'll examine fixed exchange rates and see how they are managed. You should have a basic understanding of exchange rates and understand how they are determined. While you're not explicitly asked to understand the advantages and disadvantages of exchange rate systems, it is helpful to know. I'll make a couple points regarding this in the presentation. Fixed exchange rate systems occur when the government of a country fixes the value of its currency to another currency, a basket of currencies, or a commodity such as gold. I put the image up of the Bahamas because many Caribbean islands peg or fix the value of their currency against the American dollar because they are heavily dependent on the US for tourism. A government operating a fixed exchange rate regime will intervene in the foreign exchange market or use the interest rate to influence the supply and demand for the currency. We'll define what happens when they aim to increase or decrease the value of the currency in the next slide. We'll then look at how it's done. When discussing the revaluation or devaluation of currencies, we are generally referring to fixed exchange rate regimes. Revaluation occurs when a government intervenes to increase the value of its currency relative to another. If a country sets its exchange rate to 2-to-1 against the dollar and then allows it to increase to 1-to-1, then we say that it has revalued. Devaluation occurs when a government intervenes to decrease the value of its currency relative to another. If a country sets its exchange rate to 1-to-1 against the dollar and then allows it to decrease to 2-to-1, then we say that it has devalued. Next, we'll see how a government actively intervenes to keep the exchange rate fixed. Although China no longer operates a fixed exchange rate regime, having moved over to a managed float system, we can actually use a country's currency history to help us understand the two different exchange rate systems. For this example, we will look at the period of time in which China fixed the value of the yuan to the dollar at about 8.28 to the dollar. This value held from 1994 to 2005. How it's changed since we will look at in the next video. Imagine that the Chinese government wants to keep the value of the currency at ER star relative to the dollar. If $1 buys 8.28 yuan, then we know that 1 yuan equals $0.120 or about 12.1 cents. I arrived at this figure by dividing $1 by 8.28. Suppose the demand for Chinese exports rises significantly and the yuan starts to strengthen against the dollar. This would make Chinese exports more expensive to American buyers and could potentially hurt the export-led growth and development the Chinese government pursued during that time frame. So in order to maintain stability in export markets, the Chinese government would intervene by increasing the supply of yuan in the foreign exchange market. This would decrease the value of the currency and it would return to its original exchange rate with the United States dollar. The government essentially takes actions to offset any increase or decrease in the exchange rate. If it wants to decrease the exchange rate, it sells off its own currency or the central bank takes action.
Hey guys, this video will look at the concept of a dirty floating exchange rate. Now, in international trade, the exchange rate is the value of one currency in terms of another. So the exchange rate, and this being the nominal exchange rate, is the value of one currency in terms of another. And now there are two types of exchange rates. Firstly, the fixed exchange rate, and secondly, the floating exchange rate. And since 1983, following the financial systems deregulation, Australia has adopted what is known as a floating exchange rate. The floating exchange rate is where the value of the Australian dollar is determined by market forces of supply and demand. And so at equilibrium, we can see that the USD to Australia exchange rate, for example, the quantity applied, we know that the supply of Australian dollars is constant at any given time, and the demand has a negative slope. So the equilibrium level is determined by this market forces of supply and demand. So that being the E, or the fundamental exchange rate. I'm just going to call that E1. Supply 1 and demand 1. Okay. So that's the concept of a floating exchange rate, and that's what Australia has adopted. And if we want to go further into depth of what a floating exchange rate actually is, I'd encourage you to look at our lecture on the floating exchange rate. So Australia has adopted what is called a floating exchange rate. However, the dirty float is sort of an amalgamation of both the fixed and floating exchange rate. And what that means is that the RBA can affect the market value of the AUD as it wishes by becoming a net buyer or seller of the AUD. So in that case, it can manipulate the exchange rate by affecting the supply or demand for the Australian dollars. Nowadays, it is only in very special occasions that the RBA adopts this dirty float tactic, which could in fact lead to domestic instability. So it is only in dramatic cases where the RBA actually adopts a dirty float tactic, and so these are, say, erratic or uninformed changes to international transactions, so say the GFC, or very volatile change in economic activity overseas, that the RBA adopts this dirty float. So they adopt this dirty float in order to stabilize domestic economic policy, only in the face of international or overriding uncertainty. So in most cases, they don't actually adopt the dirty float, but it is there for the RBA to use in times of uncertainty. So we're going to look at how the RBA can apply this idea of becoming a net buyer and a seller. So instead of fixing the exchange rate at one price, it could actually manipulate the price of the exchange rate as it wishes. So if it wanted to decrease the value of the exchange rate, it could act as a net seller, or it could act as a net seller of the Australian dollar. So what it does, it increases the supply of the AUD from S1 to S2. When it increases the supply, we can see that the equilibrium price will actually decrease from E1 to E2. When it acts as a net buyer in order to increase the demand for the Australian dollar, we can see the demand shifts from D1 to D2 or D3, and as a result, the equilibrium price of the exchange rate increases.
Hi, this video is all about Managed Float Exchange Rate System. It will give you a brief introduction to the topic. Exchange rate of currency refers to its value measured in terms of a foreign currency. The Managed Float Exchange Rate System is a system that combines the features of a freely flowing exchange rate system with an occasional intervention by the government to moderate the undue term fluctuations. For the Managed Float Exchange Rate System, the band for fluctuations will be undisclosed. Singapore and China are two countries that adopt the Managed Float Exchange System. The band for fluctuations will be undisclosed. Singapore and China are two countries that adopt the Managed Float Exchange System. Singapore is a country that adopts the modest appreciation of their currency. For the benefits of the Managed Float Exchange Rate System, there would be some degree of exchange rate stability, thus leading to less speculation activity. However, the negative point about Managed Float Exchange Rate System is that there would be a problem related to the need to maintain foreign exchange reserves because the government needs to intervene by appreciating or depreciating the currency by either selling away or buying back their currency. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll keep coming back for more topics, so please visit our website www.j
After World War II, it was clear the world needed a new financial system. The gold standard was considered too rigid, but at the same time, economists were worried that countries would devalue their currency to boost exports. For this reason, 44 countries sent delegates to a conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, as of the 1st of July 1944. The US, which held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves after the war, was obviously the most influential player, and ultimately, all currencies ended up linked to the dollar, and the dollar was linked to gold. One important concern arose, though. If a country goes through an economic crisis, how can it get out of it without devaluing its currency? To address this issue, two institutions were created. One, the International Monetary Fund, which was supposed to lend money to countries that are in trouble and cannot attract financing from other sources. Two, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is now called the World Bank, and was supposed to help less developed countries grow. Unfortunately, as good as it may have sounded on paper, the Bretton Woods system didn't survive because the United States kept running deficits to fund various projects, and therefore, the amount of dollars in existence kept increasing while the gold reserves of the US kept shrinking, as more countries demanded gold in exchange for their dollars. As such, on the 15th of August 1971, Nixon officially announced that dollars would no longer be convertible to gold, thereby putting the final nail in the coffin of the Bretton Woods system. After World War II, it was clear the world needed a new financial system. The gold standard was considered too rigid, but at the same time, economists were worried that countries would devalue their currency to boost exports. For this reason, 44 countries sent delegates to a conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, as of the 1st of July 1944. The US, which held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves after the war, was obviously the most influential player, and ultimately, all currencies ended up linked to the dollar, and the dollar was linked to gold. One important concern arose, though. If a country goes through an economic crisis, how can it get out of it without devaluing its currency? To address this issue, two institutions were created. One, the International Monetary Fund, which was supposed to lend money to countries that are in trouble and cannot attract financing from other sources. Two, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is now called the World Bank, and was supposed to help less developed countries grow. Unfortunately, as good as it may have sounded on paper, the Bretton Woods system didn't survive because the United States kept running deficits to fund various projects, and therefore, the amount of dollars in existence kept increasing while the gold reserves of the US kept shrinking, as more countries demanded gold in exchange for their dollars. As such, on the 15th of August 1971, Nixon officially announced that dollars would no longer be convertible to gold, thereby putting the final nail in the coffin of the Bretton Woods system. After World War II, it was clear the world needed a new financial system. The gold standard was considered too rigid, but at the same time, economists were worried that countries would devalue their currency to boost exports. For this reason, 44 countries sent delegates to a conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, as of the 1st of July 1944. The US